Good morning. Now, Mr. McGregor, are we ready to begin?
Yes, my lord. The next witness is Mr. Stephen Maddocks. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Maddocks. Now, as you're aware, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. McGregor, who's sitting opposite you. But first, I believe you're prepared to take the oath.
Yes.
Sitting where you are, could I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That I will tell the truth.
That I will tell the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maddocks. Now, we sit generally between 10 and take a lunch break at 1. But between these times, we'll take a coffee break at about 11:30. Now, what I say to every witness is that while we're having a sort of fixed break, if they, for any reason, want to take a break during the day, you just have to indicate to me. It's please feel that you're in control of the situation. Right, Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, my lord. You're Stephen Maddocks, is that correct?
I am.
And you've provided 2 reports to the inquiry. You've provided a previous report to the inquiry and gave evidence, but you've provided a further report to the inquiry dated the 13th of December 2023. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And just for the benefit of core participants, that's available at pages 3 to 56 of Bundle 1 of the reports and statements. The content of that further report, which deals with critical care ventilation systems at the Royal Hospital for Children and the Department for Clinical Neurosciences, that will form part of your evidence to the inquiry. You're also going to be asked some questions by me today. If you want to refer to your report at any point, please just do let me know. Any documents I want to take you to should come up on the large screen in front of you. If for any reason you can't see them or you're seeing something different to the document I'm referring to, please just do let me know.
Thank you.
In relation to your qualifications and experience, those are set out in a biography included as an appendix to your report. But in summary, you're a chartered building services engineer, is that correct?
That's correct.
You've got 40 years industry experience.
A bit more now, but yes.
Thank you.
Over 40.
You're a member of the Chartered Institute of Building Service Engineers and have been since 1995, a chartered engineer since 1996. And you've been a fellow of the Institute of Healthcare Engineering and Estate Management since 2005, is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And in addition to those issues, you've also worked on a number of hospital projects throughout your career.
That's correct.
If I could perhaps just look to your report to begin with, please, and if we could look to page 5 within the bundle. So that'll be in bundle 1 of the witness statements. Look to page 5.
Thank you.
So bundle 1 of the witness statements, please. And to page 5. See in the executive summary, you say this report is a review of the design, commissioning and validation documents associated with the ventilation systems for critical care rooms at the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and the Department for Clinical Neurosciences in Edinburgh. Am I correct in saying that in the executive summary, your professional opinion is that the ventilation system for critical care is now designed and functioning in compliance with published guidance and best practice?
That's correct.
And also your professional opinion is that from an engineering perspective, the ventilation system in critical care provides a suitable environment for the delivery of safe, effective, person-centred care?
That's correct.
Thank you. I want to begin by looking at some general issues, and then we'll look at some specific issues relating to the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and the Department for Clinical Neurosciences. I'll just refer to that as the project. If I use that term, that's what I'm referring to. If I could begin, though, by asking you to look at a document within Bundle 13, Volume 3, at page 554. So this is a document called the Scottish Health Facilities Note 30, Infection Control in the Built Environment Design and Planning. This is an iteration from 2007. The current version is from 2014.
Thank you.
If I can ask you to look on within that document to page 574, please. And you see at the top, there's a bold heading that's called Common Errors. Do you see that?
Yes.
It says 5.5, Common Errors in Design and Construction, adapted from Carter and Barr 1997, due to inept or non-existent risk management includes, and then if we look to the second bullet point, it says incorrect air turnover and airflow patterns. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
So again, just drawing on your experience working in this space, if we're thinking back to 2007, was it well recognised that common errors, common mistakes could include getting pressure cascades and air change rates wrong?
I think pressure cascades is probably the challenge rather than air change rates, because trying to get that pressure cascade from clean to dirty is quite tricky and is not necessarily engineering solely related. And the same with air change rate, because rooms often leak. If you're trying to pressurise a space and get a cascade through a space, you need the room to be airtight and impermeable surfaces, otherwise it won't work.
Okay.
So it's not just a ventilation system. It's about the whole infrastructure, the building and the engineering.
Thank you. And then if I could ask you to look on to page 576, please. Paragraph 5.19, you'll see that there's a conclusion that's set out here, which states the integration of prevention and control of infection risk management and construction is in its infancy. It represents a significant change in the management of healthcare facilities design and planning, which will take time to develop to a level at which the greatest benefits can be achieved. Just as important then is the need to carry out research in the area of risk management, prevention and control of infection in the built environment to produce sound, irrefutable evidence on which to base further risk management strategies. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, the last time you gave evidence, you talked in a general sense about studies that had been done, particularly in the 1970s by Dr. Lidwell. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
So we see here 2007 Scottish Health Facilities note saying that certainly by 2007, infection prevention and control, how that links into the built environment, that was something that further research really needed to be carried out to really understand the links. Was that your understanding as at 2007?
I think so, yeah. I mean, if the first sentence, infection risk management construction is in its infancy. It really was. It was a new concept that infection prevention teams existed and were able to inform designers. I still think there are not enough of them to do that role. They very much focus on the day-to-day operational issues, and they don't have enough capacity to look at new developments because of other aspects of infection prevention control in healthcare. And the research that it mentions is ongoing. There are still, certainly post-COVID, there are many universities, two I can think of, that are involved in healthcare-acquired research.
So if we think about the period pre-COVID to begin with, 2007, need for research, was there a lot of research that went on to try to bottom out these issues in that period?
I can't recall publishing of papers. It's not something I've really focused on in that particular period. The research tends to happen in the background, and you pick it up when you get a new version of a health building note or a health technical memoranda. You tend to pick up. I'm a little bit closer to it now because of the work I'm doing with the CIBSE healthcare group.
So if that's the period up to COVID, are you aware of any further research that takes place either in the period the COVID pandemic is taking place or in the subsequent period?
Yes, there's been a lot of research by University of Leeds, University of Liverpool on ventilation in particular, the use of ultraviolet systems and HEPA filtration systems and air scrubbers in rooms to, a lot of it is driven by the net zero carbon agenda to try and reduce energy and reduce big ventilation systems. So that has been evolving. There was new documentation published in November last year about the use of ultraviolet cleaning air scrubbers and HEPA scrubbers within buildings. That was published by NHS England, November 23.
So if we think through the research that you said was being done at the University of Liverpool and the University of Leeds, in broad terms, what's that research looking at?
Looking at the efficacy of those systems and whether you can use, I think there's a new term that's come into the industry called equivalent air changes. So in the past, you would look to change the air in the room from a centralised ventilation system, but now these in-room air scrubbers will recirculate and clean the air in the space and give you an equivalent air change rate, and that will kill any viruses, bacteria, or capture any particles in those spaces. So it means you don't have a massive piece of infrastructure from a plant room all the way down to a room.
Okay, and just in general terms, from an engineer's perspective, you use the term an air scrubber. What is that and what does it do?
It's, imagine it's just like the filter on your car. And it's just taking, the air scrubbers could be just a filter to remove any particulates that we emit as people and dust and so on. And the ultraviolet aspect, ultraviolet's been around for quite a number of years as a known technique to kill viruses and bacteria, particularly mortar systems. So it's relatively new in the commercial or the healthcare environment. You might see that in shops where you used to have those bug zappers that were those sort of things. It's that sort of device where you pass air across a series of ultraviolet lamps and it kills viruses and bacteria. And if you continually recirculate air over one of those, then you will clean the air in that space.
And again, just so I'm understanding things, the science and technology, if we look to HTMs, SHTMs, they talk about an air change rate per hour. Are you telling the inquiry that science and technology is moving on? So in addition to a straight air change per hour, you can also have an equivalent air change rate. And again, if you could just explain in simple terms for those of us that don't work in the space, what's an equivalent air change rate and how does it differ from a simple air change?
Simple air change rate is the grills that we see in this room push air in and take air out, and the air would change so many times an hour. Equivalent air change rate is, imagine if you have a small filing cabinet, possibly smaller than that unit there, with a fan in it that just circulates the air around the space. And I can't recall the number of air changes, but you have a fan in there that you can turn on, and just like a fan heater at home, you just turn it from 1 speed, 2 speed, 3 speed, and it will just circulate the air. So the number of times that the air moves around that space is the equivalent air change rate.
And again, I'd pick you up as saying, I think there had perhaps been guidance published in late 2023, is that correct? And again, in broad terms, what does that guidance say?
It just advocates that they are acceptable for use. They've gone through a lot of research. They've gone through various committees and approval processes within the NHS in England to say that they issued 2 NHS technical bulletins to cover the use of these devices, because lots of people were trying to sell them and people were buying them and they weren't sure whether they were the right thing. And there are certain characteristics within each one. It's very new technology in terms of the approved use of it. So it really, I use the word approved, sanctioned the use of these devices, and manufacturers are now offering products to say that our product complies with that technical bulletin.
And these are technical bulletins issued in England and Wales, is that correct?
Yes.
Mr. McGregor, if I can just intervene, just make sure if I'm keeping up, Mr. Maddocks. You made the point that the technology is advancing.
Yes.
You told us about air scrubbing.
Yes.
By, for example, there may be other techniques, but one technique is ultraviolet light.
The ultraviolet kills any viruses or bacteria in the airstream.
Right. Now, just so that I'm keeping up, you give the example of a fairly small unit with a fan in it.
Yeah.
Now, does that unit incorporate an air scrubbing technology?
It has a bank of ultraviolet lights inside it. Because obviously you can't look at an ultraviolet light, it will damage your eyes. So they're in sealed containers and the airflow goes across the bank of lights to kill the bacteria. And if it was a HEPA filter, which is basically a very fine filter, the air gets passed through, it gets drawn in and blown around and cleaned.
Right. Thank you very much. Sorry, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. And I think just the final issue to ask you about by way of introduction, you mentioned work that you had done on the SIBSI Healthcare Committee. Could you just explain what work you've been doing?
We are a group of authorising engineers, design engineers. We meet quarterly and discuss new technologies. We get past copies of draft documents that are going to be published by the NHS for comment to see whether we think it's up to date, and members of our committee sit on the various, they contribute to new guidance. So we take industry knowledge, feed into things, so that way the NHS get a balanced view from design professionals, people who visit hospitals every day as authorising engineers and pick up faults. So they feed back operational issues, manufacturers with new products come in. So we do meetings, discuss new technologies, new projects, new ideas. We have webinars from manufacturers and people who look at new technologies like the ultraviolet systems, and people from research. Professor Tony Fisher from the University of Liverpool has presented on the UVC side, I think the last 12 months. So my role is just really secretary, just to issue the minutes and what have you.
Okay, so you would sit on that committee, effectively consider new technologies that are emerging and provide some form of input in relation to that?
Yeah, we've got 2 documents that have come to us in the last few weeks. So there's a few of us will read those documents. We will put commentary against each paragraph, like the one in front of us, and would say, we don't necessarily agree with 5.15. Have you considered this? And we will put a response together. That again goes back to the Central Committee of Publication team within NHS Estates or NHS, and they will review those comments and decide what to do with them.
Thank you. And in terms of the research, should the inquiry understand that that is research that's ongoing at the moment into relatively new technologies which are generating content such as options including equivalent air change rates rather than simply the standard air changes per hour that we've looked at in the past?
Yes.
Thank you. And I want to move on and ask you some specific questions about the project itself. And to begin by asking you about the contractual specification at financial close. Now, it's appropriate to say at the outset, the contractual specification is a matter of dispute between a number of core participants involved in the public inquiry, and it's no function of the public inquiry to work out what the definitive, correct contractual interpretation is. But if we just think about some of the issues that are in play, one of the disputes in this particular project was the exact status of the environmental matrix. Was this simply provided in the tender documents as a document that was a guide that couldn't be relied upon, or was it a fixed contractual brief? Regardless of how the briefing was done by NHS Lothian, by the point the contract was signed, the project agreement was signed, should the board's technical requirements for the ventilation system have been in absolute final form, in your opinion?
I believe so, yes.
And can you just explain, if that doesn't take place, if you don't have an absolutely crystal clear lockdown brief, what are the problems and risks for a project?
It's a risk item for design development and potential cost increase, programme delays, and it just allows an element to be debated further. The design will only have been taken up to a certain point at financial close, but not having a clear brief, you need to sort of ring fence some money, time to allow that to be, it might be for very good reasons that it's not been done. It does happen on some projects where people can't define the brief for a variety of reasons because they're anticipating a change in technology. It just needs to be clear that something isn't defined or finalised, and an allowance be made within a risk register.
And if you were including aspects of the technical brief within reviewable design data, you talked about reviewable design data in the past, and you've said there's nothing wrong with the concept of reviewable design data for large projects. But if you're taking part of the brief, it's not finalised, it's not locked down when the contract's signed, and that's pushed into reviewable design data, what problems could potentially emerge later in a project?
Just impact on the design, impact on the buildability issues, impact on plant delivery, design time to finalise that, the fact that you then need to figure a mechanism to resolve those issues once you're in contract. So what you then need to be calling, the technical team, the client team to finalise that brief. So it's an anomaly that you need to try and avoid if you can, because it will just take potentially along, the clock is ticking. If you want to get that resolved, you need to be, in my opinion, a surety of what the design principle will be, what the design requirements will be.
And the inquiry's heard a lot of evidence about 10 air changes per hour as opposed to 4 air changes per hour. It's also heard evidence that it's not as simple as just cranking the system up. There would be a whole host of knock-on issues that you need to think about in terms of the design of the air handling units, the capacity of the pipework. Could you just try to explain in your own words, if you don't lock down the number of air changes you're going to have for a space, you don't resolve whether it's going to be 10 or it's going to be 4, how difficult is that from a design perspective the further into the project you get?
Very, very difficult. It's such a big difference between the two numbers. It has such a knock-on effect from the size of the grill. If we use this room as an example, the size and the number of the grills in this room would increase. The ductwork that serves them increases. The air handling unit that serves the ductwork increases. The heating systems, the electrical systems that power the fans, all those increase in magnitude. Depending on how big the systems are, it might result, because a small area might be fed by one air handling unit or a number of air handling units. It just has a complete knock-on effect all the way through the process.
And again, just from understanding, what impact, if any, would that have on price? You obviously have a contract, you agree that, it's a package of rights, and you pay a certain sum of money. What impact, if any, would that have on price?
It would increase.
You
only highlight, when you design a system, you only put unless the brief tells you otherwise, you only put a small margin on the calculated air volume of an air handling unit. So you add up all the grill volumes, you say let's call it 10 cubic meters per second. That air handling unit's designed at 10 cubic meters per second. It's a physical dimension of X by Y by Z, and it costs so much. That would increase. So all those aspects of that piece of kit will take longer to deliver. The plant room might not be big enough. So it just has a complete knock-on effect all the way down the line. The allowance that you might have on the 10 cubic meter per second may be 5 or 10%. And that's due to allowances for leakage in the ductwork over the 20 years that you anticipate the system might be, and for filters getting dirty. So you do building a small allowance, and SHTM 0301 has those limits specified now in the current version. But certainly not to go from 4 to 10 for major areas.
Thank you. If I could ask you to look within your report, please, onto section 2 and to page 12, please.
Page 12.
Page 12. So we're in bundle 1 of the witness statements and reports, and page 12. And you see that you address the design brief documents, and you say, I understand that the status of various documents issued during the tender process is controversial, in particular the status of the EM issued during the tender process. As an engineer, I do not offer any comment on that matter. In this section of the report, I have proceeded on the basis of the documents that the designers TUV should consider were the relevant briefing documents. Do you see that?
I do.
So at this stage, you're not saying this is the contractual brief. You're saying I'm prepared to look at this section of my report on what the designers TUV should say they think that the design documents are. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And proceeding on that assumption that all of the documents listed as A to J constituted the briefing documents. On that basis, having seen those documents, do you consider that the final design complied with published guidance, including SHTM 0301?
The tough sud design. I don't believe the air change rate. I think the air change rate is clear in the SHTM 0301.
Okay. So you don't think that even on the basis of that documentation, we'll come on and look at board construction requirements in a moment, but if that was the brief, the design that comes back isn't meeting that because there's not full compliance with SHTM 0301?
Correct.
Thank you. If I can ask you to look over the page onto page 13, please, and to paragraph 2.1.3. You say, I've been asked by the inquiry team to proceed on the assumption that during the competitive tender process, the competing companies were provided with items A and B together with the board's construction requirements. Do you see that?
I do.
So again, for the purposes of your report, you've fully considered the board construction requirements that were issued to tenders.
I have reviewed them.
If I can ask you to look to some aspects of the board construction requirements themselves, please. If we could look to bundle 1 and to page 779.
Thank you.
Bundle 1, page 779 is the start of the board's construction requirements. And if I could ask you to look on, please, to page 789. Page 789, you see that the general requirements are set out, which states this document sets out the key design criteria and the core requirements to create a modern facility to re-provide services to the existing RHSC, existing CAMS and the existing DCN in a single building adjoining the RIE facilities at the campus. The design shall be enduring and take account of the history, culture and physical requirements of these internationally renowned centres of excellence. Do you see that?
I do.
So it states right at the start, this is going to be an internationally renowned centre of excellence. If I could ask you to look on, please, to page 797. You see section 2, the bold heading, project-wide requirements. Do you see that? So it states, the board's vision is to provide high-quality, patient-centred services from modern facilities. Do you see that? If we just think about critical care, we'll come on and look at that in a minute, and again, controversial as to what the exact contractual requirements were. But in your opinion, by the point we're in 2015 when the contract's being signed, would rooms in critical care that had 4 air changes per hour as opposed to 10 air changes per hour, from an engineering perspective, would that be providing high-quality, patient-centred services from modern facilities?
No.
And can you just explain why not?
In my opinion, the SHTM requirement was clear that it's 10 air changes and 4 was not meeting that modern facility because that standard was in place at the time.
Okay. And if you were faced with a brief, you're the designer, have a brief that says, forget about published guidance, what I want in critical care is 4 air changes per hour. And as an engineer, you know that the published guidance says 10 air changes per hour. What, if anything, from either a professional and or an ethical perspective, would you do?
You'd write to the client or your client and flag it up as an issue, as a risk, that the brief, in your opinion, doesn't meet the recognised standards.
Again, just so I'm understanding, if you got a set of board construction requirements that said, I'm building a world-renowned facility, I need it to be providing high-quality, patient-centred modern facilities, and you're provided with a brief that says, actually, what I want is less than 50% of what the published guidance says, that for you is something that you would want to raise with the client and have specific confirmation that they were wanting to derogate from the published guidance?
Absolutely.
Thank you. If we could look on, still within the board construction requirements, to page 800 and to paragraph 2.3, the NHS requirements. It says, in addition to the standards listed in paragraph 2.4 of this subsection C, unless the board has expressed elsewhere in the board's construction requirements a specific and different requirement, the facility shall comply with, but not be limited to, the provisions of the NHS requirements, as the same may amend from time to time. And you see a number of documents listed, including F, HFN and SHFN, and then H, HTM and SHTM. So again, I'm not asking you as an engineer to resolve this difficulty, but just for your information, the 2 schools of thought in relation to the project are, one school of thought says there simply has to be full compliance with published guidance, SHTM 0301. The other school of thought is to say there has to be general compliance with that, but the environmental matrix with lower parameters was a specific fixed brief that trumped those general requirements. Those are the two issues that are in play, but I'm not asking you to resolve that issue today. If I could ask you to look on, still within the board construction requirements, to page 821, please. And you'll see that there's a section 3.6.3, room data sheets. And if we could look to the final paragraph in that section beginning, for the avoidance of doubt, do you see that?
I do.
So they say, for the avoidance of doubt, Project Co shall provide mechanical ventilation, comfort cooling and air conditioning to suit the functional requirements of each of the rooms in the facilities. Irrespective of the ventilation requirements in room data sheets, where rooms are clearly intended to be occupied and/or become internal spaces during design development and natural ventilation is not possible, mechanical ventilation and/or extract ventilation shall be provided as appropriate to suit the function of the space. Do you see that?
I do.
So there's a reference here to the fact that the mechanical ventilation must be appropriate to suit the function of the space. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, as an engineer, is that a judgment you can make, or do you need to look to others to make that judgment for you?
I would reference the tables in the SHTM 0301 and deem that was the standard that was deemed appropriate for those spaces, because there are various rates of air change rate for different room functions. So that would be my default position to start with.
Thank you. And then if I can ask you to look on, still within the board construction requirements, to page 880, please. You see section 8, which is headed mechanical and electrical engineering requirements. Do you see that?
I do.
So it says Project Co shall provide the works to comply with the environmental matrix. Project Co shall, in carrying out the works, comply with the following non-exhaustive list of mechanical and electrical requirements. Project Co shall provide mechanical and electrical systems that help create a state-of-the-art building with innovative design. Do you see that?
I do.
So again, if you were presented with the brief that potentially has the environmental matrix, it's a fixed requirement, 4 air changes per hour, but you're being told really the whole ethos is to provide mechanical and electrical systems that are state-of-the-art and innovative. Can the two of those be reconciled, and what, if anything, do you do from a professional and ethical perspective?
If and this is hypothetical, if let's say as an example, the ultraviolet technical bulletins were published back then, and they weren't bound into the HTMs at the time because they've been written in parallel, you might say to the client, we can save some money by using this innovative brand new technology that will save infrastructure. There are, these are the options, the pros and cons of that. And that's where you would be saying to somebody, you've found a state-of-the-art modern technology, because the HTMs are revised periodically, and techniques and advances in technology often move faster than the publication. So that's where you'd bring in state-of-the-art. Also means more about the infrastructure for, I would say, for IT development, and whether you're using remote medical equipment monitoring. There's not much massive state-of-the-art in pipes and ventilation systems. The heat source is now changing because of net zero carbon agenda, but you still need heat in a space. You still need air going into a space. It's the quantum of that, and what new technologies you may, as a designer, have come across that aren't embraced within the board's construction requirements. And you would offer it as something that's, when you're a competing bidder, you would say, we've come up with this new idea that will save some money. And that's where you would look to what is state of the art in mechanical and ventilation terms.
Thank you. If we just think for a moment about the environmental matrix itself, the inquiry's heard evidence that really the proper construction of the environmental matrix is that it was simply provided to tenderers as a helpful guide. It was for them to take it on and develop it, but they couldn't rely upon it. It was simply a draft for tenderers to do with it what they wanted. In your view, would the provision of a draft environmental matrix, would that be something that would be helpful to a design team?
It would be helpful to the engineers.
Okay. And why do you say that?
it makes life easier to just look at a series of, I can't remember how many pages it was, say 20 pages of data, whereas room data sheets have got a lot of information. So the matrix extracts that data so that the mechanical engineer or the electrical engineer can focus on their tasks in hand.
And if that's provided as a draft, but ultimately in the tender bid, the designer would have to take responsibility for it as their own document, how difficult a process would it be to check the accuracy of the environmental matrix as opposed to making up a brand new environmental matrix from scratch?
To actually go through and check it, it's what you would normally do. You'd go through and just start looking at those numbers and using those air change rates to work out how big your air handling systems are going to be, where the risers are going to be.
So is there really going to be any saving in time to design team if they get given a draft that they have to check, as opposed to simply starting from scratch and having to create their own?
Yeah, because the draft would be somebody's done that work for you. They've had the thought process and sitting down and going through in terms of what I believe is the reference design. So yeah, they've gone through that learning curve and that process to try and establish what the brief for the hospital is.
So if you were working for a company that was submitting a tender for a new hospital, and you were provided with a document that was simply called a draft environmental matrix, what would you think the purpose of that document was?
To inform you of what the client's intent was going to be.
Because if I could just perhaps ask you to look to your report, page 13, paragraph 2.1.5. You say, I do not offer any view on the status of the EM. However, the production of a project-specific EM would, in my opinion, be viewed by an engineer as a statement of the client's specific requirements unless the contrary intention was clearly stated. There would be no point in issuing such a document unless it contained a client-specific project brief. There would be no point in a client issuing a draft EM that could not be relied on by the engineer. Do you see that?
I do.
And could you just explain what are you telling the inquiry here at paragraph 2.1.5 in terms of what you see the utility of a draft environmental matrix being?
It's taken a lot of the discussion and agreement out. You've got the departments all listed with what you really feel the client wants. And as the mechanical engineer, you'd be looking through that instead of having to go through all the documentation to pull out what those numbers might be. So it's really telling you that, right, that is a specific operational issue. Let's take isolation rooms, whether it's a negative room or a positive pressure room. You just have that status in mind as to, rather than having to go back to the client's engineering team or the clinician's team, it's all laid down there for you already, that level of brief clarification has already been undertaken.
Thank you. In your previous report and previous evidence, you addressed the issue of room data sheets and room data sheets as opposed to an environmental matrix. You explained that room data sheets can be made up from the activity database system. You tell us within your report that it's now technically possible to create an environmental matrix from the activity database. Is that correct?
I believe, yes.
And how do you know that?
I've spoken with Talon Solutions, who write the activity database product. They own that. That used to be an NHS England generated product. And when everything became privatised, Talon Solution bought the rights to it and they update that. And it's basically a database like any Microsoft Access database. And I asked the question, can you pull out just the lines of the any aspect within that data sheet, whether it's temperature, ventilation, lighting levels, acoustics, you can pull those out as reports because it's all online. It's data. You can just produce a report based on whatever parameters you want.
Thank you. And the inquiry's heard evidence previously that the activity database, it should have all of the most up-to-date information within it. It's not always 100% accurate. Is that your understanding, that it's a good starting point, but it's not always 100% accurate?
Correct. They've told me that it would be updated, checked every 6 months or whenever any new guidance came out.
So if you were producing an environmental matrix using the ADB system, an engineer would still have to check everything to make sure it was correct.
You would just go through and just double check it and perhaps red flag anything that you didn't, based on your experience, or just doing a cross check against something within one of the HTMs that were relevant and applicable.
And inquiries heard a lot of evidence about room data sheets, environmental matrices. On the project, that there seemed to be both. There was both room data sheets and an environmental matrix. Do you think that is a helpful procedure to have both those types of documents in play?
I personally don't. I think there's an element of confusion that could have crept in.
Okay. So again, just so I'm understanding things, if you're having a brief or you're setting out exactly what the requirements are, presumably that has to be done somewhere, but in your view, is it unhelpful to have multiple documents doing that?
Absolutely, because I think you could miss something between documentation production.
Okay, so whatever is being used to capture the brief and the design, that should be one document in your view?
In my opinion, the term I've heard recently is one source of truth.
One source of truth?
Yeah.
And presumably that's so that there's not then ongoing discussions about, is the room data sheet correct, is the environmental matrix right?
Correct.
You just simply go to one point and you know exactly what the environmental parameters are.
Absolutely. And it's a lot easier with digital systems now to do that, with database systems and the way that the reports can be generated off them.
Thank you.
You use the expression reports can be generated from them. Again, just make sure I'm following things. When you use the word reports, that would include environmental matrices.
Yes, anything that's on the room data sheet,
Yes.
any line of entry, you can produce a report from it. A simple example is a double switch socket outlet. You would have all those room data sheets for all those rooms. They would have a list of all the components within those rooms. And you might say, well, how many double switch socket outlets are there? You can go into the system and produce a report and it says you've got 5,000 double switch socket outlets. You've got 2,000 single. So any element of data within the room data sheet can be extracted as a separate, I'll use the term report, or it's more like a collation of that information, just so you have a single report. Let's say another one will be lighting levels. You want to look at what the lighting levels are going to be, and you could just press a report and it says up and give you all the rooms with all the lighting levels.
Right. Thank you.
Mr. Maddocks, I'd like to just move on and ask you about a slightly different issue, and that would be to think about SHTM 0301, the 2014 version, which is the one that would be in play in relation to the project, and to ask you some questions about the position that TUV Sud have adopted in relation to that document. So if I could ask you to have in front of you, please, Bundle 1, page 757. So Bundle 1, page 757. Which is a document entitled Critical Care Department Briefing Review, April 2022. Do you see that?
I do.
And if we could look on, please, to page 761. The executive summary states, from our review of all reference documents, we have not found any guidance with regards to ventilation rates other than that provided for new...
Sorry, just...
Okay.
Thanks. Sorry about that. Yes, I see that.
It says, from our review of all reference documents, we've not found any guidance with regards to ventilation rates other than that provided for neutropenic patient ward and isolation rooms, the later of which confirms the requirement for pressurised lobbies to plus 10 pascals and 10 air changes per hour. Do you see that?
I do.
And Mr. McKechnie, in his evidence, stated a very similar position, that if you're talking about a requirement for 10 pascals of positive pressure and 10 air changes per hour, that's really just for isolation rooms in critical care in terms of SHTM 0301, the 2014 version. Do you agree with that view?
I don't.
Okay. And why not?
In my opinion, the table within SHTM 0301, which lists all the departments, It lists critical care areas with supply ventilation and 10 air changes an hour at 10 pascals. There's a small note at the side about the potential for isolation rooms being at negative pressure, but I see that as an all-encompassing requirement for the critical care area.
And if I could perhaps just ask you to look to Scottish Health Technical Memorandum 0301, the February 2014 version, that begins in bundle 1 at page 1035.
Yes. Thank you.
If we look on to page 1058, please. See in the middle of the page is the bold heading ventilation for general areas. So it says at paragraph 2.19, table A1 provides recommended air change rates, temperatures and pressures for general areas that require mechanical ventilation in healthcare buildings. Do you see that?
I do.
And then if we look on to page 1116, if we look to paragraph 7.2, it says the following departments will require a degree of specialised ventilation. Do you see that?
Yes.
Then if we look to the bullet points approximately halfway down the page, do you see that there's one that says critical areas and high dependency units of any type? Do you see that?
I do.
And then below that it says isolation facilities. Do you see that?
Yes.
So again, if we're just thinking through that view, specialised ventilation, come on and look at the table in a moment, 10 pascals of positive pressure and 10 air changes per hour. That's only for isolation rooms in critical care. That's not really what we see within the guidance. It says critical care areas and high dependency units of any type, and then as a separate entry, isolation facilities. Do you see that?
I do, yeah.
And is that your understanding that you just explained a moment ago, that really these are separate entries that both require degrees of specialised ventilation?
Correct. You can have an isolation facility on a general ward. There are wards, general wards, that are made, the single bedrooms are made isolation facilities.
Thank you. And Mr McKechnie, both in his witness statement and in his evidence, one of the issues that he raised was to say, well, he wasn't aware of any other hospital in the United Kingdom whereby 10 air changes had been specified generally for all parts of critical care areas. He was only aware of those specific requirements for isolation rooms. Can you help the inquiry? Are you aware of any hospitals in the United Kingdom whereby critical care areas generally are specified as 10 pascals of positive pressure and 10 air changes per hour?
The ones I've been involved with where you've got critical care, or it might have been referenced as an ITU, have been done at 10.
Sorry, just again, the ones that you've been
The
involved
ones that I've been involved with have been done with the critical care, or ITU as it's called, intensive therapy unit as it's called. They've been done at 10 air changes, 10
right,
pascals.
for the whole area.
For the whole area, yes.
Yep. Thank you.
And whenever we're talking about projects you've worked on, are we talking about one project, more than one?
Bishop Auckland Hospital. Mine's gone blank. Bishop Auckland Hospital, there was spaces within Hexham Hospital that had smaller critical care areas at 10 air changes. Those two immediately spring to mind. Ulster Hospital, which is one we completed a few years ago, that was 10 air changes.
Okay. So multiple projects you've worked on where the specification would be for critical care, 10 air changes per hour and 10 pascals of positive pressure.
Correct.
Thank you. If I could ask you to look to Bundle 7, Volume 2 at page 30, please. So Bundle 7, Volume 2 at page 30, please. And it's the email towards the bottom of the page, which is from an Edward McLaughlin,
Thank you.
who worked for Health Facilities Scotland, to Brian Curry on the 17th of July 2019. It's just for the wording at point 2 towards the bottom of the page, 3 lines up from the bottom. Mr McLaughlin says the review appears to focus on an interpretation of the guidance as relating to isolation rooms rather than critical care areas. So that's really the TUV Sudan interpretation that we've just looked at. As the application column in Table 1A of SHTM 0301 states that it refers to critical care areas and isolation rooms are mentioned separately, we can see no justification for this interpretation. Do you see that?
Yes.
So Mr McLaughlin's view is, considered what's been put forward by TUV Sud, but I don't agree with that interpretation. And again, just to be clear, do you agree with Mr McLaughlin's views?
I just can't see the second. It says we can see no. Is on the second page.
So if we just turn over the page onto page 31, it should continue justification for this interpretation.
I agree with that statement.
Thank you. And if I could ask you to have your report in front of you, please. And if we look within bundle 1 of the witness statements and reports to page 17, please. And to paragraph 2. So we're within the bundle of witness statements, please. And 2.3.2, you say, in my opinion, the reference to critical care areas would generally be interpreted by an engineer as referring to the spaces within any space within a complete critical care department, including single and multi-bed bedrooms, with the exception of specific rooms such as listed in Appendix 1 of SHTM 0301, which are typically encountered across many other departments in a hospital which are in a critical care unit. Common spaces such as toilets, bathrooms, staff bays, dirty utility, clean utility, offices, linen bays, waiting areas and seminar rooms where the environment, particularly air changes per hour, is different to the bed areas where critical care nursing is administered. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
So again, your opinion is that your interpretation and Mr McLaughlin's interpretation would be the generally understood meaning of SHTM 0301, is that correct?
Correct.
So again, should the inquiry understand that your position would be that the views expressed by TUV Sud would be an outlier?
Would be what, sorry?
Would be an outlier. Thank you.
Correct.
One other issue that I'd wish to raise with you is changes that were made to the environmental matrix during the course of the project. So the inquiries heard evidence that there was a change made to a guidance note contained within the environmental matrix, guidance note 10. So, guidance note 15. Guidance note 15 originally referred to critical care areas requiring 10 air changes per hour. That was then changed to make it refer simply to isolation rooms. The inquiries also heard evidence that there's certainly one school of thought that the environmental matrix was a fixed brief to the designers. So again, just drawing on your experience working in this space, if you were given a fixed brief by a client, you were given an environmental matrix and told that is just completely fixed, you need to design to this environmental matrix, would you as a designer be able to simply change aspects of that document without client approval?
No, I wouldn't have done, no.
Okay. So if you had wanted to make a change to a fixed brief, how would you go about doing that?
You'd raise a request for clarification. You'd issue a document, a letter, or if you had what's called an RFI tracker, you'd have a query on a piece of briefing information, and you'd seek clarity from that and seek somebody to respond and acknowledge that.
Thank you. And when you refer to an RFI tracker, what does RFI stand for?
Request for information.
Request for information, thank you. Linked to that, if we could perhaps just discuss more generally the procedure for derogations. We'll come on and talk about the new procedures for derogations and the ventilation safety groups. But if we think back to 2015 to 2019, what was the procedure, if any, for trying to agree a derogation from guidance?
They would all be project specific based on the project management team involved. The project manager might issue a RFI tracker or a derogation tracker, and you as designers would fill those in with your clarification or your. We do it now with just basically an Excel spreadsheet. Something, they have a list of queries, reference numbers. then you leave them open or closed. So basic sort of project management to close out queries.
And in terms of best practice, would you be expecting to see some form of risk assessment being carried out if there was going to be a derogation from published
Ideally,
guidance?
one would be supplied to justify why there'd been a change.
And you say ideally, at this point in time, was there a standard established procedure as to how you would go about derogations, or was it simply project to project?
Project specific.
Okay. And in terms of even now, we'll come on and talk about the ventilation safety group. If a client came to you and said, I understand this is what the guidance says, but I want to derogate from the guidance, is there a standard off-the-shelf could be up so that every derogation for these projects in Scotland would be exactly the same, or is it still project specific?
I believe it would be project specific.
Do you think it would be an improvement, particularly in the healthcare space, if there was a standard form derogation so that everyone doing these projects did the same process and had the same documentation?
I think it would make life easier to keep track of things and pick up sort of lessons learned as you go through a project.
Okay, thank you. I'd now like to look at some of the room data sheets for the project itself. You mentioned a number and include copies within your report, but if we could perhaps just look within bundle 1 to page 1597. This is an example of one room data sheet.
Thank you.
You see the room code B160901, 4-bed low acuity. Do you see that?
I do.
And you tell us within your report B1, that would mean a critical care room. If we look over the page onto page 1598, see the requirements there stated as 4.0 in relation to air changes per hour. Do you see that?
I do.
So should the inquiry understand that that's lower than what you would interpret the requirement to be from the table A1 and SHTM 0301?
Critical care room, correct.
Now, on the right-hand side, this is a room within critical care, and the ventilation type is described as natural and central supply air. Do you see that?
I do.
Do you have any observations on the fact there's a reference to natural ventilation in a critical care room?
I wouldn't be using natural.
Okay. And why not?
Because it's a critical care area that you want to control the environment. You've got very poorly patients. It's also contradictory to the table A1 in HCM 0301, which clearly says supply. I think the second column has supply, extract, or natural, or all three. That is not accepted. It's not acceptable in the critical care to open windows, in my opinion.
Thank you. And just going back to the codes, the inquiries heard evidence that B1 meant critical care. As an engineer, is that something that you would know about, or is that something that clinicians would know about?
In terms of
B1, if you saw B1 written down, would that have any meaning to you? Would you automatically work out that means critical care?
no, that's a project-specific numbering system.
Thank you.
It could mean level 1, department B. It's a project. That number there, the room number, is project-specific.
Thank you. Within your report, you go on to address the specification for the ventilation system, including at Settlement Agreement 1. There's no dispute that in terms of Settlement Agreement 1, the technical schedule states that certain rooms have to have 4 air changes per hour and balanced or negative pressure. In your opinion, did that comply with SHTM 0301 for critical care spaces?
4 air changes? No.
And if I could ask you to look on within your report, please, to page 32. And paragraph 4.1.1. You say, I understand that after financial close, NHSL and IHSL entered into a settlement agreement 1. This set out that 4 air changes per hour were required for certain critical care rooms. From an engineering perspective, in my opinion, this was a mistake. Do you see that?
I do.
And again, if you could just help the inquiry, are you saying this is a minor error or a major mistake in relation to critical care?
I think it's a major mistake.
Thank you. Now, you do say within your report that you weren't aware when you were producing the report of any risk assessment that was undertaken. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Now, there was a risk assessment, and I'll take you to it now. If we could have a look within the bundles to bundle 6 and to page 14, please. So you'll see at the top of the page, it says record of general risk assessment. The names of the assessors are given and various other details. And then if we look to the wording just under subject of assessment, consider task or environment, do you see that?
Yes.
And it says bedroom ventilation design in 4-bedded rooms does not meet the recommendations of SHTM 0301 as the current design has the 4-bedded rooms as being positive pressure. Do you see that? So what this room is saying is the current specification is positive pressure, and that doesn't comply with SHTM 0301. In relation to critical care areas, do you agree with that?
I don't know, because table A1 says positive pressure 10 pascals for critical care areas.
So if you had been shown this risk assessment by a clinical team that said, we're being offered positive pressure and we don't want positive pressure because it doesn't comply with the guidance, you'd be saying, yes, it does.
Correct.
Thank you. Now, within the document, there's a clinical justification for the cohorting of patients. So if we just look below the text I've read out, you'll see the sentence beginning to allow cohorting. Do you see that?
Yes.
So it says, to allow cohorting of patients with the same airborne infections, these rooms require to be balanced or negative pressure. We then skip the next paragraph. It continues, whilst the board can rationalise the number of 4-bedded rooms where the ventilation needs to change with RHCYP, it should be noted that this does not reduce overall flexibility and future-proofing. A further review was undertaken with the children's CMT in January 2018 of the initial risk assessment completed in July 2017 to ascertain what 4-bedded rooms would be essential. Given the different patient groups related to specific wards, separate risk assessments have been undertaken, see attached. Individual risk assessments have identified that the need for cohorting of patients is only an issue for the children's service. Risk assessment highlights that it is essential to change the ventilation in 7 of the 4-bedded rooms within RHCYP. It would be desirable to change the ventilation in 6 of the 4-bedded rooms within RHCYP. No change to 7 of the 4-bedded rooms in RHCYP and DCN. The risk assessments have been discussed with the children's CMT and infection control and prevention, who have confirmed that not having the ability to cohort patients is not acceptable from a patient safety perspective. Do you see that?
I do.
So effectively, the inquiry's heard evidence that from a clinical perspective, clinicians said, we need to cohort patients, for example, patients with RSV. And to do that, we're going to do that by balanced or negative pressure.
Correct.
And the inquiry's heard evidence from infection prevention, an infection prevention control doctor that says, well, yes, the guidance might say positive pressure, but actually for certain patients with RSV, cohorting them with balanced or negative pressure, it's just another way of approaching the problem. There's no issue with that. From your perspective then, as an engineer, if you were presented with this with a clinical justification for a departure from guidance in relation to positive pressure, is that what you would need to be able to be comfortable about there being non-compliance with what's set out in table
Yes.
A1?
Correct.
But in relation to the risk assessment, while that would deal with the pressure issue, would that do anything at all in relation to whether it's 10 air changes per hour or 4 air changes per hour?
I didn't see anything within that risk assessment that mentioned the air change rate.
The next issue that I'd like to move on and ask you about is commissioning and validation. So the inquiry has heard evidence that in relation to SHTM 0301, there had to be both commissioning and validation done. And the infection prevention and control doctor that gave evidence said that he would expect there to be a very short validation report that was provided to him that effectively said the system is functioning in compliance with published guidance and all that's required is ongoing maintenance. That was his evidence. Would you be able to help the inquiry in terms of the validation report? Would your understanding be that that would be something that could be done by the contractor and handed over? Or would there be an expectation that that was done independently, done by an independent third party?
There's an expectation that it is a requirement. I think it's a third party after everything has been completed. Commissioning is really turning the fans on, balancing the system to make sure when you turn the fan on in an air handling unit, the air doesn't go where you want it to go. So you have to spend a lot of time accessing ductwork with ceilings taken out to make sure the air gets delivered down the right duct and to the right floor at the right volume in accordance with the design. So that's the commissioning exercise. It's very much a to and fro exercise and undertaken during the finalisation of the build process. So the commissioning engineer will balance the system and say that is doing what the design intent was in terms of the airflow rate. The validation is a review when everything's clean, tidy, and they just go and measure the air volumes. They don't balance the system because that's already been done. So they will do a report measuring, and IOM have produced a lot of those validation reports, really from the air intake all the way through to check that that system complies with the brief. This is the SHTM 0301 in this case.
Thank you. And if we just look to some of the validation reports that were provided by IOM, this is still at the stage that we're dealing with the specification under Settlement Agreement 1. So if we look to Bundle 1, please, and to page 2929. And then if we look on to page 2934, please. You see there's the bold heading in the middle of the page, high dependency areas. Do you see that?
I do.
And it says testing of the high dependency areas identified that the air change rates and pressure cascades did not meet the requirements. In early discussion with the Health Board's technical advisors, Mott MacDonald were advised that there was derogation in place which reduced the requirements from 10 air changes per hour to 4. The test information was summarised in an initial briefing to the Health Board during week commencing session in July. It later transpired that there was some confusion on the detail of the derogation and the construction supply chain, and the Health Board began working on both an interim solution to provide the situation and a longer-term permanent solution. The final results of the high dependency areas were as follows, and then you see a range of tables that are being set out with the supply air change rate meeting 3.4, 3.1, 3.2. Do you see that?
I do.
So in relation to the validation report, can all the validation report tell you is whether in a binary sense there is or is not compliance with the published guidance? The engineers can't tell you whether the space is safe or unsafe because that's a clinical judgment.
Correct, yes.
The next issue that I'd wish to ask you some questions about is high value change notice 107 and settlement agreement 2, which you address within the report. But in simple terms, there is a clear and unambiguous instruction that the critical care area is required to have a positive pressure and 10 air changes per hour. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
We just think to the physical works that would be required to make those changes, to go from having the system that had 4 air changes per hour balanced and negative to 10 air changes positive pressure. Are we talking about major or minor works that are required within a hospital?
Within the department and within the plant room and the risers that serve that department, then fairly major intervention would have been required. You'd have to have gone back and start the calculations from the rooms all the way back up to the plant room and see what ducts were impacted. Some ducts may have been designed at a lower velocity and could achieve a higher velocity. So it's just a question of really forensically going through that whole ductwork network to see what needed to change.
And in terms of the physical works required, are we talking about that being dirty building work that's required in terms of physically ripping things out and making changes?
Potentially, yes, because you've got to take the ductwork out, which the ductwork is usually the first, because it's so big, it's the first piece of engineering that goes into a corridor, and then you put pipe work and cables underneath it. So you'd have to try and then you've got to take the ceilings down. You might have to put more holes through partitions because the ductwork's larger. So yeah, within that critical department and the connections to the plant room, it would be fairly intrusive.
And from your perspective, do you think it would be realistic to undertake those types of work in a hospital with patients in situ in the hospital?
Not within the department, certainly, because many hospitals have refurbishment programs underway where they refurbish a ward or a floor and they just lock those areas off, they screen them off. So you wouldn't necessarily close the whole hospital, you just close the department and the departments that are directly impacted by that work. It might be the corridor, be screened off for a period of time.
Okay, thank you. And if I could just ask you to look to your report, please, at page 43 and to paragraph 5.1.5.1. If we could pick matters up 3 lines down, beginning parts of the hospital, do you see that?
Yes.
You tell us that parts of the hospital would have to be declared as no-go areas for staff and patients, whilst the remedial work was carried out on levels 1 and 3, and it is envisaged that disruption would be incurred on some of the primary systems, such as heating and chilled water networks, electric power and control systems, which, whilst this could be programmed, could have impacted on clinical functionality in other areas not directly affected by the works. Do you see that?
Yes.
Thank you. You tell us within your report that you were provided with IOM test results following High Value Change Notice 107, Settlement Agreement 2, works were carried out, IOM come in and do testing, and you tell us that you've reviewed those test results for the purposes of your report. Is that correct?
That's correct.
We'll come on and look at them, but just in general terms, what did the IOM test results show?
That it met the 10 air changes per hour.
Okay, so from your perspective, changes made and the IOM test results are showing full compliance with published guidance, including SHTM 0301.
Correct.
Thank you. If we could look within bundle 1, please, to page 2995. So bundle 1, page 2995. So top left-hand corner, IOM, we see this as a services report, date of site work, January/February 2021, ventilation validation, Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and Department of Clinical Neurosciences. If we could look on to page 3000, please. You see that there's a table there with areas of ventilation details. You see the B1 code, which the inquiry's heard evidence is for critical care. If we perhaps just look approximately midway down that table, you'll see that there's an entry for 1B1009. Do you see that?
Yes.
Which is a B1. And then if you look across to the supply design air changes per hour, do we see that as 10?
Yes.
And then if we look all the way across to the pressure, it's stated as positive 11 PA. Do you see that?
I do.
If we look on to page 3002, just to pick another example, we look approximately a third of the way down that page, you'll see that there's 2 entries for 1B1065. Do you see that?
I do.
And again, if we look across, you'll see that the supply design air changes is 10. You see that?
Yes.
And then if we look across, so page 3002, and it's the entries for B1065, showing supply design air changes per hour of 10. And again, if we look over to the pressure, it's stated as positive 11 PA. Do you see that?
I do.
And if we look on to page 3006, see the conclusions section. Based on the information provided by NHS Lothian, there's then a series of bullet points, and it then states the system is acceptable at the time of validation, it is considered fit for purpose, and will only require routine maintenance in order to remain so for its projected life. Do you see that?
I do.
Thank you. Then if we look on to page 3008, you see that there's a document on Turner-headed paper, headed Supplemental Agreement number 2, Ventilation Works, Design Assurance Statement, and then after the letters A to E, do you see a sentence beginning, I confirm?
I do.
It says, I confirm in my capacity as Lothian Health Board's authorising engineer ventilation that I've completed a review of IHSL Lothian Limited's design response to HVC 107 as detailed in the following documentation as it exists on 4 February 2021, together with Part B of the scope, and confirm to the NHS Lothian Health Board my opinion that the contents of the design proposal therein should allow Project Co to meet the requirements of Part A of the scope. I've monitored the design development and I consider that it should be possible for the design included in Part B of the scope to meet the requirements of Part A of the scope. This is not an acceptance on my part of any design liability. I've witnessed the standard installation and the commissioning activities of the new air handling units and consider that they meet the full requirements of SHTM 0301. I further consider that these units are fit for their projected purpose if these installations are adequately maintained. Do you see that?
I do.
So we see the raw data, the test report showing positive pressure, 10 air changes per hour. We see a design assurance statement being provided by the authorising engineer stating that in his opinion there's now full compliance with the requirements of SHTM 0301. Do you see that?
I do.
Then if we could look on, still within the appendices to the IOM report, to page 3014. You see that there's an email exchange between Paul Jamieson and Ronnie Henderson. Second full paragraph beginning, I as discussed, do you see that?
I do.
Which states, I as discussed on the day the physical inspections we made indicate that the DACN units look superior to the previous Sandomento units installed on the site. Do you see that?
I do.
Does that mean anything to you as an engineer, the difference between DACN units and Sandomento units?
Yes.
What are they and what are the differences?
Quality.
So should the inquiry understand that whatever was in before, the air handling units that have now been installed within the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People, they're superior to what was in the original specification?
Based on that statement and my own experience, that the Dakin units are more, the Sandomento ones might be compliant, but the build quality of the Dakin units is better.
Okay. And what is it about them that makes them better?
Oh, gosh. Better quality material, build quality. The specification is still the same. They're just, there are simple things like the access handles on the doors are easier to use, easier to maintain. We had the Sandomento units on a job and they weren't the best quality.
Thank you.
But they were compliant at that time on that project.
If I can ask you to look on, please, still within bundle 1, to page 3233. To 3233, please. This is a document headed AHU Remedials Cover Sheet. If you've looked at the third paragraph, So page 3233. AHU remedial cover sheet, third paragraph, which says, as discussed and agreed between the board and the AEs representing IOM and Turner PES, and to satisfy board governance, could all participants in the AHU review process please sign each individual AHU sheet, as well as in the table below, recording that the unit meets the criteria set out in section 8 of SHTM 0301, and return a scanned copy. All reviewers will be given a complete copy once all signatures are received. Do you see that?
I do.
And then if we look at the bottom, we see the organisations that are effectively signing off on the new specification as commissioned and validated. So we've got from NHSL their commissioning manager, an individual from Infection Prevention and Control, a microbiologist, technical advisor Mott MacDonald, authorising engineer from Turner, independent validation by IOM, and also involvement from HFS. Do you see that?
I do.
So reviews by a range of individuals, not just engineers, in relation to the suitability of the ventilation system. And then if I could just ask you to look back to your report, please, page 44, paragraph 5.2.4. You tell us within the report, the ventilation system in critical care and isolation rooms at the RHCYP/DCN has been designed, tested, commissioned and validated in compliance with published guidance SHTM 0301 and best practice. And is that following a review of all of the documentation provided to you, including the documentation we've looked at today?
That's correct.
Thank you. And you continue, the ventilation system has therefore been independently checked by IOM and demonstrated to be in accordance with the design requirements detailed in SHTM 0301 as noted in figure 30 below. From an engineering perspective, the ventilation system in the critical care and isolation rooms in the RHCYP/DCN is adequate for its intended purpose. The critical care and isolation rooms provide a suitable environment for the delivery of safe, effective and person-centred care. Do you see that?
That's correct.
The next issue that I'd wish to go on and ask you about is revised guidance, which comes in 2022. So Scottish Health Technical Memorandum 0301, which is issued at that point. And to ask you for your views on some of the innovations in relation to that document, including the creation of the ventilation safety group. So before we come and look at the document, could you just explain in broad terms, what is the ventilation safety group?
The ventilation safety group is a collective of a multidisciplinary team of individuals to review the ventilation systems in a hospital. It will consider an authorising engineer who was independent of the hospital trust, the authorising persons within the trust who maintain and manage the systems. You would hopefully have an infection prevention control person on the team. And from the operational management side, so it's a collective of people with experience in ventilation who will look at a design and review it and pass comment if it's a new design, or they will undertake regular maintenance reviews to check that the systems are currently being maintained.
And do you see it as an improvement on the previous system?
Very much so.
And could you just explain why do you see it as an improvement?
You get feedback from people who are operating systems on a day-to-day basis. So when you've got a new design in place, the ventilation safety group are asked to look at that design and say, well, actually, on this site, we found this a problem, we found this a problem. And one of the things that I do when I go and see trust is what sort of custom and practices developed on a site. So you understand how they maintain things, what maintenance contracts they have in place. And that operational feedback is really important for a designer, to allow the designer to improve their design, their knowledge and experience, and get first-hand feedback from people that say, actually, you can't do that because I need access to fire damper or a balancing damper. And some engineers who are new to hospital design don't have that pool of knowledge to access.
So a multidisciplinary approach in relation to key issues in relation to critical systems, particularly the ventilation system.
Yes, and it's specific to sites as well, because a site in the centre of Edinburgh would be very different to one on the edge of the suburbs, from an air pollution and all the the filtration standards, the temperatures, all the parameters that would influence the ventilation system can vary from site to site, from NHS trust to NHS trust. So having that operational feedback from site teams and local IPCs is invaluable.
Okay. And in terms of a derogation, now that SHTM 0301/2022 is in place, if there's going to be a derogation from the standards set out in the guidance, what role does the Ventilation Safety Group have in that type of decision?
They would review the derogations and look at whether they could accommodate them within their working practices. A derogation may impact on maintenance protocols, maintenance processes. It may be a temperature issue or an air change issue, the cohorting of patients being one example. The local practice clinically might be different for a whole host of reasons that are beyond the engineer to question, but they might change the way something is to be designed. Air change rate or positive negative pressure as examples.
Thank you. And within Bundle 1, if we could look to page 2286, please, which is within SHTM 0301. And if we could look towards the bottom of the page, which is headed up Ventilation Safety Group. See paragraph 4.4. So page 2286.
Thank you.
It states the management of the ventilation system of a healthcare provider should be overseen by a ventilation safety group. The VSG should have clearly defined roles and responsibilities, be part of a healthcare organisation's governance structure, and report to the designated person at board level. It should be led and chaired by a person who has appropriate management responsibility, knowledge, competency and experience. For example, the designated person. At 4.5, we see the multidisciplinary group that should be included, so authorising engineers, infection prevention control, authorised person, estates, and then over the page on to page 2287, clinicians and specialist departments, personnel from the finance department and other stakeholders. And we see at 4.6, it says the VSG remit should be to assess all aspects of ventilation safety and resilience required for the safe development and operation of healthcare premises, and it should inform the following, and that includes the design process of new healthcare premises, the design process for modification of existing premises, and the commissioning and validation process. Do you see that?
I do.
So in terms of key design issues or key issues relating to stepping away from guidance, there's now a procedure whereby authorising engineers, infection prevention control, estates personnel, microbiologists and any other relevant disciplines, they're all involved in the decision-making process. Is that
Absolutely,
right?
Yes.
So if we think back to the clinical risk assessment that we looked at in relation to the cohorting of patients, perhaps previously that would have been done by clinicians. It might have had some input from infection prevention control. There's now a structured procedure whereby, at the very least, clinicians, infection prevention control and the design engineer should all be sitting down, having a discussion and making sure that everyone understands what's going on and is comfortable with the decisions that are being made.
Yeah, I think the word you use there is the structured approach. Some of those people may have sat in one area looking at certain aspects, but bringing everybody together in that forum to review that is a massive improvement.
Thank you.
And it is happening. I'm working as a technical advisor on a project and they're early stage 2 design, and the authorising engineers are already looking at the designs alongside ourselves as TAs. Thank you.
And then just to cover off the new process for derogations, if we look to page 2288, please. See at the top of the page, bold heading, derogations and alternative design strategies. Any derogations or alternative design strategies from this guidance should be subject to the scrutiny and agreement in writing by the VSG. The reason for the derogation or alternative strategy and limits to its application should be recorded. Designers proposing a derogation or alternative design strategy should be able to supply a body of evidence that their proposal will provide a degree of safety no less than if the guidance in this document had been followed. Do you see that?
I do.
So it's not simply people making statements. There has to be a credible body of evidence to back up the alternative view.
Evidence-based change orders, yeah.
And if we just, again, think back to the example of cohorting of patients, the inquiry's heard evidence that really from an infection prevention and control perspective, there's a system for positive pressure, but there's an equally valid view in relation to balanced or negative pressure. If that approach was being adopted, we're not following the guidance, we're going with balanced or negative pressure. It's not simply that would be stated, there would be a body of evidence that backed up that decision, given the new procedures that are in place.
Yes.
Thank you. Lord Brady, I'm conscious that that's just turned 11:30. I don't anticipate being much longer with Mr. Maddocks, but I think I'd be more than a couple of moments, so now might be an appropriate point for a break.
Right. We'll take a coffee break now, Mr. Maddocks. It's now just a little after 12:30, so if you can be back for 10 to 12, that's fine. Thank you. Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Lord Brody. Mr. Maddocks, we were looking at SHTM 0301, the 2022 version. If we could still look within that document, bundle 1, and look on to page 2402, please. And you see that this deals with the new procedures for acceptance testing and validation. Do you see that?
I do.
And if we could look to paragraph 12.6 towards the bottom of the page, under the heading Design Proposal Review.
Thanks.
The new guidance states, it is essential that whoever has been appointed to carry out the final validation acceptance of the system should be involved in the initial client's brief and design specification, preferably prior to the project being put out to tender. They will then be fully aware of the client's requirements and any limiting factor. Do you see that? Now, that's a change in terms of the involvement that the individual should have. Do you see that as a positive innovation?
Very much so.
And can you just explain why?
It just reinforces the localised issues that may occur on a site, and that the team that are, the AE, whilst she is independent, they will know the way the team on site operate, and they can then inform the people who are going to inherit the system to maintain it of the issues. And the term there is limiting factors. You might always put brackets stroke derogations. So at least that the AE has gone through, and there should be no surprises when it comes to handover of the building and the system performs as per the brief.
Okay, thank you. And then if we look on to page 2407, paragraph 12.31, guidance states, it is vitally important to complete the validation process before the system is accepted by the client. Do you see that?
Yes.
Why is that important?
Once the building becomes operational, it's hard to go back in and change anything. The validation indicates that the building is complete, more than just practically complete. The finishes are all there, all the ceiling tiles are in place. So it's the validation itself is, you can almost walk into it. The only thing that you might need is to do some final microscopic testing, microbiological testing, before that the patients can then move into it. It might be done before or after a deep clean, but it's really as per, the next stage is patients come into that environment.
Okay. So checks being done before the patients are going to come in, identify any problems that can presumably then be rectified before the patients come in.
And basically, there's no change, physical change that can happen once that system is invalidated. It's like you put a seal on it, say, yeah, that's ready to go.
Thank you. And then paragraph 12.32, the validation report states, following validation, a full report detailing the findings will be produced and sent to the client's lead project manager. The report should conclude with a clear statement whether the system did or did not achieve the standards set out in the agreed design specification. And we see at paragraph 12.33, the individuals that should be provided with a copy, the head of the user department, infection prevention and control, and estates and facilities. Do you see that? Thank you. Now, within the revised table of this guidance, there's references to levels of care that would be provided. So there's no longer simply references to critical care, but there would be references to the level of care that would be being provided in specific areas of a hospital. And those are defined, if we look to page 2487. 287. Just towards the bottom of the page, you'll see definitions of level 0 care, level 1 care, and then over the page 2488, you'll see that there's definitions of level 2 care and level 3 care. Do you see that?
I do.
From an engineer's perspective, is that changed so that there's greater clarity, not just on the area, but the level of care and what the specialised ventilation requirements will be. Is that a helpful innovation from your perspective?
It's informative for an engineer. It just tells them what that space is really intended to be used for, and the importance of sticking to the guidance.
Okay, thank you. The final issue that I really want to ask you about in your evidence, Mr. Maddocks, is lessons learned and how perhaps these projects could be done better in the future. Now, within your report, you make mention of the fact that a lack of recorded involvement from infection prevention control teams during the course of the project, that doesn't particularly surprise you. You just explain to the inquiry, why doesn't that lack of involvement surprise you?
They are asked to attend, they're just overworked. And it varies from site to site how big the IPC team is, how experienced the IPC individual may be. There are many who've got obviously nursing backgrounds and are fantastic at what they do, but they're not engineers. They don't know how to design a ventilation system. I know of one lady who's gone away and done like a BTEC in building services to familiarise herself with the nuances of what we as engineers do. And that's not a criticism. It's just that it's a vital part of any operational hospital, but they just don't have the bandwidth to deal with some of these issues.
So when we're talking about multidisciplinary approaches that needs engineers, estates, infection prevention and control, should the inquiry understand your experience working in this area is that there's simply not enough infection prevention and control professionals to do the volume of work required?
Specifically with relating to the engineering, yes.
Okay, thank you. If I can ask you to look to Bundle 13, Volume 3, page 464, please. So this is the updated version of SHFN 30, which is a document produced by Health Facilities Scotland to try to address some of the issues arising from healthcare-acquired infections within the built environment in hospitals.
Thank you.
And if we could look on to page 468, please. You see just below the box, there's wording beginning scrutiny. Do you see that?
I do.
So it says scrutiny of this guidance will highlight the frequent use of the word partnership. Successful use of HAI Scribe requires participation and cooperation between estates and facility staff and infection prevention control teams. Do you see that?
I do.
The whole ethos of this document is to talk about a partnership approach, that healthcare-acquired infections, they're not simply issues for clinicians, for infection prevention and control. All disciplines involved in projects need to be involved. Now, if we look over the page, onto page 469, and you see that there's the box with note. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it says this document can provide an insight to the key factors within the built environment which can impact on prevention and control of infection. It is intended as a point of reference for healthcare estates and facilities managers, designers, project managers, contractors, engineers, surveyors, health planners, and infection prevention control teams working on health estate, new build and refurbishment projects. Do you see that?
I do.
One issue that I'd be interested in is that this is NHS guidance saying really what we need in this area for new build hospitals is a partnership approach. Do you think generally that partnership approach is taking place between the public sector and the private sector? Or from the private sector view, is there more of an adversarial approach as to a partnership approach?
I think there has been, I think construction contracts can be adversarial by the way they're written. I think the intent of this document as this point of reference, everybody's got different drivers, different guidance to work to. You know, design engineers have got one piece, AEs and maintenance teams. So it's trying to pull everybody together to make sure that the ultimate goal of the facility is met.
And do you have any ideas? How could that be improved if really what's required for these new build hospital projects is a partnership way of working whereby everyone's on the same page, considering issues including infection prevention and control. How, if at all, can that be achieved?
I think there's a partnerial contract, construction contract. I've not any personal experience of it, where it's one common goal and project insurance is covered across the project rather than held by individual organisations. So that whole ethos of a team, I'm told by a colleague who's working on one, says it's a very, very different environment. There are attempts to do that through framework contracts. Procure 23 is the English and NHS SPS, they're frameworks where that ethos tries to get passed down to ensure it's no longer an adversarial industry. So those sort of things are mechanisms that are improving that.
And you mentioned that a colleague had been working on a project which had one specific approach, including project insurance. Could you just expand on that? What did your colleague tell you about the differences, perhaps compared to a traditional design and build?
I think just openness. If there's an issue that arises, it's not just that person's fault or issue to deal with. Everybody can contribute. You see the people listed there. Everyone's got different levels of experience, and they can all contribute and not be afraid to speak out as a route to solve a problem.
Thank you. Now, in relation to your report, you draw a number of conclusions and have a number of reflections. One point you raise is that there's a requirement to follow the procedures detailed in the NHS Scotland Key Stage Assurance Reviews. So that would be for new projects. Have you had an opportunity to consider what the Key Stage Assurance Reviews are going to involve?
I've read through the documentation and the framework manuals and the checks at the various stages of a project.
And do you think that's a positive innovation?
Very much so.
And can you just explain why?
I think it just it's almost like a quality assurance process. We do this in our business where we check ourselves, and the Key Stage Assurance Reviews checks the projects. Is it still on track? Is it meeting what it's intended to do? Has it met the outputs? Has it been designed in the right way? And it's just that question and answer session. It's like a design critique. Architects are more open to design critiques, certainly through their training. They invite others to look at their designs and comment on them. Engineers have never really been trained in that way to sort of open themselves up and open their designs to do it. It is done internally within companies to obviously check that you've met your client's brief. But I think this is a much more open, third-party independent review of a design to say, yeah, you are on the right page or not. And I think it's a very positive step forward.
Thank you. The second conclusion you draw is the requirement to set up a ventilation safety group, which we've already considered within your evidence. The third issue that you raise is the need to keep one set of environmental briefing data, which again, we've covered the rationale for that. If there is going to be one set of briefing data and it is to be an environmental matrix, I would just ask for your observations on the template environmental matrix that's been produced by NHS Scotland Assure. If we could look to bundle 9, please. And to page 268. And if we could just zoom in on the blue boxes towards the left-hand side. So after item number, room number, there's then room name.
Thank you. Yeah.
And you see that there's a box for the room function. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then 2 along from that, there's clinical risk category.
Yes.
Room function, is that something that an engineer could fill in, or is that going to have to be something that a ventilation safety group makes a determination on?
I think it's one step before that. I think it's the clinicians and what they're going to use that room for. Be it clean process, dirty process. So the users really need to fill out the room function.
And from your perspective, would it be helpful if there was some form of standardisation so that you knew if a room was named a particular area, if it was ascribed to a particular room function in a particular clinical risk category? Does there need to be some form of standardisation in relation to that issue?
There is, yes, and there exists. There's a thing called repeatable rooms. So NHS Scotland have produced some document.
Sorry, I missed that. A thing called?
It's a document, I think, a document called repeatable rooms. So
repeatable rooms.
Repeatable rooms.
Thank you.
Within a hospital, you get a number of rooms that are all the same: clean utility, dirty utility, sister's office, a single bedroom. So what NHS Scotland have done is developed a standard approach. So if you've got these rooms, you can pick a guidebook up and say, right, this is the room. So the room function, the room area, the clinical risk category, they're all predefined, which helps people operating those rooms to get the same, you're not reinventing the wheel time after time.
Thank you. Within your report, you make the point at point 4 that you need to agree environmental briefing data with clinicians, which again, I think we've covered off. At point 5, you make the point that you shouldn't be carrying over key design issues after financial close. And then at point 6, you make the point of the need for a ventilation safety group at key stages of the project. At point 7, I've got noted, you make reference to the status of guidance. Now, one of the issues the inquiries had to grapple with is SHTM 0301. It is guidance, it's best practice guidance, there's a requirement to follow it, but it's not a hard-edged legal standard like you would see in a set of regulations. Do you think that's problematic in any way?
No. The English building regulations refer to HTMs. So when you go through ventilation as an example, it has different categories of buildings, offices, schools, hospitals, and it will refer you to the best practice that exists. And it says hospital technical memoranda. In schools, it refers you to the Department for Education, offices, to British Council for Offices. So the different construction sectors have got specialisms within them, and the building regulations cross-refer to those.
So again, I think you covered this in your first report and in your first set of evidence. Building regulations is a devolved area, so Scotland has its own set of building regulations. The building regulations in England and Wales, they have a set of approved documents. Effectively, if you follow the approved document, then you're complying with the building regulations. And
correct.
I think you previously told us about approved documents. F1, is that correct?
Yes.
Just in general terms, what are they?
It's the practical guide to what the building regulations state, and the building regulations are actually a statute. The approved document is the sort of implementation of that statute and tells you how to achieve that. It's got the sort of nuts and bolts and the numbers that you have to achieve in terms of air change rates or fresh air rates or things like that. Energy efficiency in particular is one for the building regulations.
So in England and Wales, you have the building regulations and then you have the approved documents, which would include HTMs. And from your perspective, that's quite helpful because you've got the legal standard and then the document you need to go to know you're complying with it. That doesn't exist in Scotland in terms of the Scottish building regulations. Do you see that as a potential gap in Scotland?
I think it could be something that improves. It's a technical handbook, I think it's called here. So yeah, I think it could be an improvement as a cross-reference to what are the best practice documents.
Thank you. One other issue that I'd like to ask you about is training, and it's both training of engineers and training of clinicians and infection prevention control specialists. You're now going to have the ventilation safety group where everyone sits together. The inquiries heard evidence that from an infection prevention and control perspective, you could be sitting on these groups, but you don't get any even basic training whatsoever in the built environment. And presumably that's the same for engineers. You could be working on this project knowing exactly what you need to do from an engineering perspective, but you don't have any basic training in infection prevention control. Do you think in terms of gaps in knowledge, it would be helpful if the engineers had some basic training in infection prevention control and the infection prevention control professionals had some basic training in the built environment?
Definitely. I think you need to appreciate how your system and what you're using and what you're designing will be used. And infection prevention control can inform engineers of what their processes are. I found it invaluable sitting when I was with microbiologists, understanding a little bit more about what their pressures, what their tensions are in their day-to-day lives. And also from a design engineer, there's nothing better than actually sitting down with a clinician to understand what their aims and objectives are for a project. I did it with orthopaedic surgeons 30 years ago when they wanted a facility, to understand why they wanted that facility. So that was a really insightful, that was when I actually worked in the NHS. So that was a really insightful time because I could actually go and meet the ward sister or the sister that was going to operate the operating department to understand how they operated. So that's a really important bit of training that I think is sadly lacking.
Thank you. The final question from me, Mr. Maddocks, at the moment is a genuine open question. We've covered a lot of ground in your 2 reports, the 2 times that you've come to give evidence. But one of the issues within the inquiry's terms of reference is, well, how could we do these projects better in the future? Apart from what you've covered in your reports and what we've covered in your evidence today, is there any other areas that you think that these projects could be done better to try to avoid some of the issues that cropped up in the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and the Department for Clinical Neurosciences?
I think get the design, it probably uses an old term that joiners used to use, measure twice, cut once. And it's get the design right, get it verified, get it checked before you embark. I think the Building Safety Act in England is going to force that, in that the gateway process within the Building Safety Act means that the designs have to be complete before you can start on site. And the problem with a lot of contracts are design was in parallel with construction. So there was always an end date and a very fast program because of funding, because of political targets to achieve an opening, or a real target because an old building was falling down, or whatever the driver was to hit an end date needs to be fully considered. And the design, let the builders build it as quickly as they can, but trying to design whilst you're in the build process is a challenge. It puts pressure on people. So I probably would say this as a designer, give us some more time to get the design right. So I think that England is struggling with the Building Safety Act, and the industry is struggling with that at the moment. It's to see how that's changing, and we'll see. The inspection and the sign-off process. There's not enough inspectors and sign-off people, so we'll see over the coming years how that changes.
Thank you, Mr. Maddocks. Thank you for answering my questions. I don't have any more questions at the moment, but Lord Brodie may have some questions, or there may be applications from core participants.
Just perhaps 2 areas, Mr. Maddocks. First of all, picking up on that last reference, if I got you correctly, you referred to the Building Safety Act, in England, which I assumed is a fairly recent piece of legislation relating to England and Wales.
It's the legislation that came out from Dame Judith Hackett's report following the Grenfell inquiry.
Right.
So that put a mandate down to improve construction, and the Building Safety Act was enacted. There was some secondary legislation that came out in October last year, which is more detail for the implementation of that, and that is the subject of many webinars, training, and so on.
All right. So just to push you a little on that, your understanding, and I can maybe follow this up. Your understanding is that there's a piece of primary legislation called the Building Safety Act.
Yes.
And there's also subordinate legislation, perhaps made in terms of that act.
I think it all comes under the Act itself. It's to do with high-risk buildings. So it starts about buildings with more than 2 residences in them, above certain heights, 18 metres being one. And Wales have changed that last week. They've gone from 18 metres down to 11 metres. So it's really an evolving piece of legislation. And we are all, as an industry, finding our way through that because of the impact on design and build contracts in particular, and when contractors come on board.
Now, the other question I would like your help on is you were asked by Mr. McGregor, first of all, to distinguish between commissioning on one hand and validation on the other. Now, first question, in looking at email correspondence, I've come across the word verification. Now, does that have any technical meaning, or is it just a word in English?
There is a definition of it, and right at this moment I just can't pull it off the top of my head, okay. But there's commissioning, verification, validation. I think the verification is that the commissioning process has met the original design volumes. The validation is a much thorough assessment of the whole system.
Right. So, as I understood your evidence, commissioning is looking at particular elements within a building system. Do they work?
The commissioning
have I got that right?
The commissioning is setting to work the systems, turning the pumps on, checking the flow rates, turning the fans on, checking the flow rates, measuring parameters, temperature. Validation is checking that the design and the system that's been installed meets the required criteria. So the commissioning exercise is more of, engineers going around site adjusting things to make the correct amount of heat come out of a radiator at the correct temperature. Whereas the validation is proving whether that actually did happen, and it does meet, you can commission a system and it not be compliant with the brief. The validation checks whether it was compliant with the brief.
And verification might be between these two stages. In other words, verification is a form of check that the commissioning has actually been carried out.
Yes.
Now,
I might be wrong, and I'd just like to check the wording on it.
For present purposes, you're the authority. You're the authority. Now, in answering Mr. McGregor's questions as to the difference between commissioning and validation, I think you explained that you would, again, if I picked it up correctly, commissioning might be done by the contractor.
Correct.
Or the specialist subcontractor.
Yes, that's correct.
In contrast to that, validation you would expect to be carried out by an independent
third party. Correct.
Third party. Now, when you were having your discussion with Mr. McGregor, where were you assuming that the obligation on the contractor to commission and then to validate came from?
The contractor would commission using his contractor, his subcontractor, to the design. So he would undertake that commissioning and say, I've met what the design figures state.
Right. Now, in answering the question from Mr. McGregor, I'm sorry to be so pedestrian about this, but were you assuming a contractual obligation to, or rather, were you seeing the source of the obligation to commission and validate as being the contract, or were you seeing it as a freestanding obligation arising from, in Scotland, the Scottish Health Technical Memorandum? Because as we've seen in relation to ventilation, Section 8 talks quite a lot about validation. I'm trying to get the structure here.
You need to commission the building.
Yeah.
You can't just turn it on. It won't work. It's dynamic, it's moving, and you need to do the commissioning exercise, and it's bound into your contract as the contractor that you will deliver the building and commission it in accordance with recognised industry practice, whichever codes they may be, ISRIA, SIBSI, whatever, to prove that you have delivered what your drawings said you were going to deliver.
And by industry practice, an example would be the SIBSI.
SIBSI codes, Building Services Research and Information Guidance, BISRIA guidance. SIBSI have what are called commissioning codes, and they have a process as to how to do that. The SHTMs have a commissioning, an operational series of checklists as well that you go through. So they have a preferred format of some of the plant items. But what we would see from commissioning contractor is all the measurements. So we'd measure the air volume coming out of the grill, and we'd look at the velocities in the ductwork. So all that's part of the commissioning process, and it's laid down as an order of which to do that. And that's what we would expect the contractor with his specialist subcontractor to present at the end of a project.
Right. Thank you. Now, as Mr. McGregor indicated, I would like to give everyone in the room an opportunity just to, through Mr. McGregor, to indicate whether there's any additional questions to be posed to you, Mr. Maddocks. And in order to do that, we'll rise for about 10 or 15 minutes to allow those in the room to communicate with Mr. McGregor. And then I'll ask you to come back, and either there may be additional questions or there may be no additional questions. But perhaps if you could take Mr. McGregor?
No additional questions, my lord.
Mr. Maddocks, there's no further questions, and that means you're free to go. But before you do so, thank you very much for your work on behalf of the inquiry. I'm grateful for it, but as I say, you're now free to go.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now, Mr. McGregor.
The next witness is Mr. Alan Morrison.
Good afternoon, Mr. Morrison. As you will understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. McGregor, who is sitting opposite. But first, I believe you're willing to take an affirmation.
Sure.
Just sitting where you are, would you repeat these words after me? I solemnly, sincerely and truly
I solemnly and sincerely and truly
declare and affirm that I will tell the truth,
I will tell the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morrison. The timetable for the day is that we will break for an hour's lunch at 1 o'clock or thereabouts, sit again at 2, and the afternoon will go as it goes. Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, my lord. You're Alan Morrison, is that correct?
Yes.
And you've provided 2 witness statements to the inquiry for the present set of hearings, is that right?
Yes.
And for the benefit of core participants, the first statement is at pages 57 to 83 of Bundle 1 of the witness statements. That deals with the establishment of NHS Scotland Assure. And then the second statement is available from pages 84 to 105. Mr. Morrison, the content of those statements will form part of your evidence to the inquiry. You're also going to be asked some questions by me today. If you do want to look at your statements at any point, please just do let me know. Equally, if there's any documents that I want to refer you to, those should come up on the big screen in front of you. If for any reason you can't see the document or the specific passage I'm referring to, please just do let me know. In terms of your background and qualifications, those are set out in your statements. You're the Deputy Director of Health Infrastructure and Sustainability with the Scottish Government, is that correct?
Correct.
And can you just explain in broad terms, what does that role involve?
So I manage the NHS kind of capital investment programme. I lead on any infrastructure related issues and net zero policies as well, as falls under my remit.
Thank you. And you tell us within your statement that you've a background in accountancy, is that right?
Yes.
You've been a civil servant since 2003, and you have been the chair of the Capital Investment Group since 2015.
Yes.
Thank you. I want to begin with the issues covered in your second statement. So that's the statement beginning from page 84 onwards. And your involvement in the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People in the Department of Clinical Neurosciences in your capacity as lead for healthcare infrastructure with the Scottish Government. The first area that I'd like to ask you questions about is an agreement which the inquiry refers to as Settlement Agreement 1. So that's an agreement that is formally signed in February of 2019, albeit there are negotiations in relation to the settlement agreement taking place throughout 2018. Could you just explain in broad terms, what was your knowledge of and involvement, if any, in Settlement Agreement 1?
So I was probably the main point of contact with NHS Lothian into the Scottish Government. So I was advised on what the settlement agreement was trying to achieve, what the issues were in terms of the technical requirements, and I was kind of kept fairly up to date on I suppose at a certain high level of progress. And then through my role at Scottish Government, I was involved in making an assessment on the governance that NHS Lothian had put in place to reach the point where they were asking the Scottish Government for additional funding to conclude the settlement. I briefed Cabinet Secretary and senior colleagues within the Scottish Government on progress.
Okay. So explain in very broad terms, what's your understanding of the problem with the project? Why has it got to this stage?
So there were, I think there were around about 80 technical issues that were still to be resolved. And this is about 2018. And there were 3 in particular that were kind of causing some concern. And I wouldn't get into the detail of the ones that were being that had been resolved. But I was involved with some of the conversations around the ventilation and drainage. I was also involved in the conversations around I suppose, how the interaction with the special purpose vehicle, the SPV, and potentially the financial challenges that IHSL might be experiencing caused by the delay to the hospital opening. I suppose I took into account NHS Lothian's kind of view on what needed to kind of progress. And as I say, it was more focused on the governance rather than the technicalities around fixing the problems.
Okay. So there's an escalation to the Scottish Government. In your opinion, how serious are the issues that are being raised with you at this point in time in relation to the project?
So the hospital is already late, so it is serious, and the fact that additional money is required of a sum of approximately £10 million, and that is a significant amount of money even in Scottish Government terms. So any time there's a project, a major capital project that's late and costing more than budgeted for is a serious issue, which is why you'll see that there are occasions when I'm briefing the Cabinet Secretary on the position and liaising with my Director of Finance as to what the next steps are.
Okay, so there's problems with the project, escalated to Scottish Government, NHS Lothian are asking for an extra £10 million. Can you just explain, how concerned are you at this point in time? We're talking in the period leading up to the settlement agreement being signed.
I mean, it's hard to kind of articulate this level of concern. I mean, so it's capital projects are by their nature complicated, and that the project that is late and over budget is not uncommon. And I suppose that the way I looked at it is what's the best way forward. So ideally, you would have it opened already on budget, but that position had not that was gone. So it's more, what's the situation facing us? What are our options to get the hospital open as soon as possible? And the settlement agreement and everything associated with that seemed like the best solution, albeit accepting that we'd rather not be in that position.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago that you were aware of some financial challenges that were facing the special purpose vehicle. Could you just explain what do you mean by the financial challenges?
So this is so I didn't speak directly to the special purpose vehicle. So but the way the contract is structured is that when the hospital opens, that's when the unitary payments start flowing from Scottish Government into NHS Lothian, then ultimately to the SPV. Because the hospital was late, then that income source for the SPV was not there. And so I think there was an element of speculation on behalf of NHS Lothian as to consequences of that income stream not being there, with of course additional costs being associated with rectifying the issues that had transpired. So it seemed fairly logical to me that there was no income, there was extra expense, that the company would potentially be in a difficult position.
So risk of insolvency at this point in time, if there's not a resolution to the issues?
Yeah, I mean, that was put to me that this situation doesn't happen very often, so that I don't think there was an awful lot of other examples we could point to and say this has happened before and we're following this route. But as I say, the logic that NHS Lothian kind of presented to me made sense and continues to make sense to me now.
So if the special purpose vehicle had gone into an insolvency procedure, how significant an issue would that have been from a Scottish Government perspective?
So this is where the complexity of the contract kind of plays into it, and I think that we were in slightly uncharted waters as to what happens. And I initially thought, well, if they can't deliver the contract, does it just effectively kind of come back to government? But that was not my understanding, that the funders would look to kind of step in and find somebody else to, if you like, take over from IHSL. That that felt an inherently risky thing to happen, to organise that kind of thing when we were very keen to get the hospital, open, ready, and delivering services. So it's kind of hard to remember just as to how real a risk that felt, but that was always it was a consideration in our kind of decisions.
Susan Goldsmith, who used to work for NHS Lothian, she gave evidence to the inquiry, and she indicated that she had a concern about the potential insolvency of the project company if there wasn't a resolution to the dispute. Essentially, for the reasons that you've given, you have a special purpose vehicle that's set up, it has debt obligations that need to be serviced, but until the hospital is finished and handed over, the monthly payments don't start to get made. So you have a scenario whereby you have a company that has outgoings, but it doesn't have any money coming in. And her view was there comes a point where that becomes unsustainable. No matter what relationship you have with lenders, if you can't service the debt, there's going to be a risk of insolvency. Is that the type of discussions you were having with Susan Goldsmith?
And I'd also say that it's not just that it's the fact that there's additional costs, that obviously when the hospital was due to open, the plan was the contractors to be off-site. So the fact that they were on-site and incurring costs. Now, quite what the relationship was between the contractor and IHSL as to how that was resolved, I was not clear, but clearly there was somebody was experiencing additional costs.
And in terms of those issues around about financial distress of the project company, Ms Goldsmith's evidence was that one concern that NHS Lothian had was that if that had happened, if the company had gone into insolvency, there was a risk that effectively the debt obligations would be called up and there would be an immediate requirement to pay back £150 million. Was that your understanding?
Yes.
And her view was that NHS Lothian didn't have £150 million, and equally the Scottish Government hadn't allocated £150 million as a potential for this project. Is that the type of discussions you're having with Ms Goldsmith?
I mean, it feels self-evident to say, but any time you come back from a meeting looking for £150 million that wasn't planned, that's not a good day. So it was almost that risk was noted, but it was, we need to find an alternative solution to that, even exploring that eventuality further.
And in terms of that risk, as you say, it's not a good day at the office if you come back from a meeting thinking that you might have to find £150 million. Is that the type of issue that would be escalated right up to the Cabinet Secretary?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. It is my recollection of the Cabinet Secretary's evidence yesterday was that she didn't have any recollection of the special purpose vehicle being in any form of financial distress. Is that your recollection?
I think the I think there was a brief, I might have touched on it, but it was more as there is this possibility. I think that if I thought it was a real possibility of that being the outcome, that would have been signalled very clearly to her. But I think it was in the context of a very complicated contractual and technical kind of discussions going on, that there was almost oh, by the way, this could happen as well, but we're looking to mitigate that risk.
So in layman's terms, did a solution have to be found to this problem?
Pretty much, yeah.
And did a solution have to be found almost at any cost to avoid that cliff edge of the £150 million?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the solution is primarily we're kind of focused on, we want the hospital open, and that and thinking about solutions as to how we get to that position. And I suppose that I don't think I was ever really truly concerned that we might be in that kind of point where we're needing to speak to our kind of central finance team and say, I need £150 million. It was a risk that I was aware of, but I don't think I ever felt it was a particularly likely outcome.
Okay. And in terms of your statement, you tell us you're involved in finance fundamentally. NHS Lothian come to you and say, we think we've managed to reach a resolution with the project company and we need some finance from you. Could you just explain what role, if any, you would have in reviewing that settlement to make sure that it was appropriate before the £10 million is handed over to NHS Lothian?
So this is where I suppose the situation that we were in now is different. But back in 2018, 2019, that the Scottish Government role was principally around reviewing the governance arrangements that NHS Lothian had established. So that'd be the kind of things of, we'd look at what other legal advisors advising them on, have other technical specialists in terms of the things that need fixed, I suppose, in layman terms. Are they content with the proposal kind of going forward? Has it gone through the board? Has it been signed off by the senior team? All these things were completed to our satisfaction, which is why we, I think it was in August 2018 that the then Director of Finance approved in principle the settlement agreement and agreeing to fund the cost of it.
So are statements being made by NHS Lothian effectively just being taken on trust at this point?
Well, it's within so what we used was effectively that they were preparing papers for their board, possibly the Finance and Resources kind of committee, that they were then sharing with us and talking us through what was being proposed. I suppose, kind of considering did we do it in trust? Well, what we didn't have is a kind of proposal to say, well, we need somebody to go in and check the homework effectively. That it was a different situation back then.
Mm-hmm. You say it's a different situation back then, but Health Facilities Scotland, for example, was an entity that existed. Why weren't Health Facilities Scotland asked to review the technical solution?
Because we felt that the Lothian's technical advisors were sufficient to make that determination, in addition to Lothian's technical staff that are employed by the board.
If Health Facilities Scotland had been asked for a view, would they have had the technical capacity to provide a view on the technical solution? I
mean, what we'd expect is that Health Facilities Scotland, if they felt they did not have that technical specialist kind of knowledge in the team, that they would procure it from the private sector for a one-off piece of work.
Okay, it's just because the reason I raise that is the inquiry's heard evidence at the point that the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People, Department for Clinical Neurosciences, and the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, the point that both those major projects are being undertaken, that there's one engineer working within Health Facilities Scotland. Were you aware of that?
So I've heard that. I'm not sure that's true. I think Eddie McLaughlin's an engineer who's Assistant Director, Ian Storer and Kate Dupree are all engineers that I knew at Health Facilities Scotland. I mean, I suppose your broader point is whether it's one or three, whether that is sufficient. I I suppose I would defer to Health Facility Scotland on their staffing structure, and that at no stage do I recall speaking to Health Facility Scotland, and I spoke to them regularly, did they say we have insufficient resource to do what we're being asked to do. It was a pressurised time for them, particularly in the Queen Elizabeth. That took up a lot of their time. And I suppose there would be an element of choice as to whether they how they would allocate that kind of resource that they had. But I don't recall not asking them because I didn't think that they had the technical resource in the team.
So why not ask HFS for a review? You have a project that's in trouble, a technical solution being put forward, and you have an expert body in HFS. Why not ask them for a review?
So I think in benefit of hindsight, that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and that's what we would certainly do now through NHS Assure. But at the time that we felt that the technical specialist being used by NHS Lothian was sufficient.
Okay, so future projects, you now have NHS Scotland Assure, and is part of the reason for NHS Scotland Assure being set up because there's perhaps an identified gap in governance procedures on the part of the Scottish Government?
I mean, basically, NHS Assure was set up to stop what happened at the Sick Kids happening again in very broad terms. There's obviously a question as to how they do that and the processes that they follow and where accountability and responsibility lies in individual projects. But basically, that we, I think, acknowledged that it was a gap, and on the back of both the Edinburgh Children's Hospital and the Queen Elizabeth, that we needed to make a change, which is why we introduced NHS Scotland Assure.
In terms,
Sorry, Mr. McGregor, just from my note, I think I heard you say, Ms. Morrison, NHS Assure was essentially set up to stop what happened at the Sick Kids happening again. Did I get that correctly? Thank you. Sorry, Mr. McGregor.
I was just going to ask for your views. Grant Thornton, whenever they reviewed the project, they described what had happened as one of collective failure. You've perhaps heard that term. Would you accept that when we're talking about collective failures, one of the failures is the governance procedures around about Settlement Agreement 1?
Sorry,
would you accept that one of the failures in the project was the governance procedures around about Settlement Agreement 1 and the provision of the money by Scottish Government?
So it's not clear to me that the Settlement Agreement 1 is directly related to the reasons why the hospital was delayed in July 2019. My understanding was that the problems were almost established before that, and the technical issues that they were working through did not relate to their changes, but I could be mistaken in that.
Well, I appreciate you're not a technical person, but the inquiry has heard some evidence that really, if there was any ambiguity, the problems were absolutely hardwired in terms of the technical schedule to Settlement Agreement 1. So if that did take place, if we're really talking about an ambiguity around about the requirements and then a hardwiring in Settlement Agreement 1 of non-compliance with published guidance, would you accept that the failure on the part of the Scottish Government to get some form of assurance in the technical schedule was a failure in governance?
I think, and with benefit in hindsight, then yes, I think that's reasonable.
Okay. So in terms of what assurances were provided, you've mentioned that really there was a satisfaction with what had been happening on the part of NHS Lothian. What assurances, if any, did you think NHS Lothian had obtained in relation to the technical solution that became Settlement Agreement 1?
So my understanding was the technical advisors had been working with SPV closely to identify the solutions that were required, and as well as the technical advice, they were getting legal advice on the commercial considerations. And I think Scottish Futures Trust were involved to some extent in these kind of conversations as well, though to what extent I'm not entirely sure.
And from your perspective, the fact that there was technical advice, legal advice was deemed as sufficient at that point,
Yes.
albeit you now accept that there would be an independent check carried out by NHS Scotland Assure.
Yes, so if we were presented with a similar position today, NHS Assure they would already be involved in a way that would be different than back in 2018, 2019. But yes, we've made a change.
Were you aware that one of the things that would happen as soon as Settlement Agreement 1 was signed is that the hospital would effectively be handed over, it would be accepted by NHS Lothian, and the monthly payments would begin?
So Scottish Government approved the settlement agreement in, I think, August 2018. And I thought that that would quickly lead to the settlement agreement being signed in August or almost immediately afterwards, because I thought that they had reached a point where that both parties were in agreement as to what happened, what was the value of the money required. But of course, it was not until February that was signed, and I don't know the details as to that there was commercial considerations or there was some further negotiations about the exact specifics of what would be included in the agreement. So when we approved it, I don't think that the hospital was ready to be handed over. But clearly what we wanted is, through that settlement agreement, a way forward to deal with all the technical issues that had been identified and then subsequently cleared. And then the hospital could be accepted, and then the commissioning phase starts and services move in 3-4 months later.
The inquiries heard evidence regarding a procedure called HEI scribe or high scribe. You've possibly heard of that subsequent to the period of time you were involved in the project, but 2018 through early 2019, is that something, HEI scribe, that was on your radar or the Scottish Government's radar?
So it wasn't on my radar. Now, the HEI scribe, as you probably know, is more the Chief Nursing Officer's kind of area of responsibility. And they lead in that. Now, quite the process required of what you need to go through HEI scribe to take on a new facility. It wasn't on my radar, and even now I only have a kind of fairly limited understanding of what's involved in that process.
The reason I raise it is the inquiries heard evidence that the settlement agreement is entered into. There is an obligation then to accept the hospital and to make the monthly payments. And that all takes place before the stage 4 high scribe takes place. So effectively you are accepting the building, it's handed over before standard safety checks are carried out. Is that something you were aware of at the time within Scottish Government? If you had been advised of that, if you'd been advised that part of the deal involved NHS Lothian either skipping or pushing back a standard procedure aimed at safety, is that something that would have been of concern to Scottish Government?
So if it's framed like that, no. I mean, so my basic understanding of the fourth stage in HEI scribe is basically the operational aspect of a hospital working. I don't know whether that is done prior to services moving in at the commissioning stage, or whether as services settle down, people get into a rhythm of how they are working within the new facility, whether that kind of comes 3-6 months later. I don't know, but I suppose to answer the question direct, that was not part of our consideration as to whether it had been. I suppose there'd be an assumption that if NHS Lothian thought it was appropriate through their infection control teams to follow that, then I'd expect them to have done the necessary. But if they concluded that actually we need to work in the hospital for 3-6 months, and the IPC were on board with that, that wouldn't strike me as unreasonable.
If High Scribe is aimed at safety and it says you shouldn't be accepting a hospital until stage 4 is completed, is that not something that the Scottish Government should have been checking directly with the NHS Lothian before it provided £10 million of public money?
As I say, because when we approved the settlement agreement, it was in August. I don't think so. There was a 6-month gap between us approving that payment and it eventually being signed with the provider. I guess it's where accountability lies for the decision making back in 2018, 2019. That delegation was to the health board, and it still, I suppose, remains with the health board. It's just that these days now we have a more involved kind of, we're more involved with the process of commissioning and accepting the hospital.
And in terms of that greater involvement that takes place now, is that really a recognition on the part of the Scottish Government that there were failings in the previous checks and balances in the system?
So in general, yes. I mean, not specifically in terms of HAI Scribe stage 4. It was, I think it was a recognition that something clearly went badly wrong and we needed to do something differently.
And NHS Lothian, in their submissions to the inquiry, they've described Settlement Agreement 1 effectively as a bailout of the project. Was that your understanding of what was taking place?
Not sure I would phrase it like that. It was more, it was necessary to get to the project point where it's completed and the hospital's handed over and services delivered from it.
Thank you. Lord Bray, I'm conscious that's just after 1 o'clock. Now might be an appropriate time to break for lunch.
Yes, as I said, Mr. Morrison, we take our lunch break at 1. So could I ask you to be back for 2 o'clock?
But
Thank you.